The Thing in the Kentucky River. If you put in along the Kentucky River near High Bridge, you'll find that span of water to be a fairly bustling place. The route upstream away from the lock is studded with rentals and river homes, boat docks in varying stages of decay, and, especially on weekends, groups of college kids and bored professionals out from Lexington on guided kayak trips. These mostly head up under the vast, looming old rail track that gives High Bridge its name, and then immediately bank right onto the smaller, more languid Dix River. Up that way, one can easily access waterfalls on tree-shrouded tributaries, or come up to the foot of the Dix Dam. The current, thanks to the dam, is all but non-existent most days, and the easy riding makes for good, touristy beginner outings. But if one weaves past that point, further up the Kentucky, they find the houses die off quick. A series of nature preserves, like Dupree and Beam and Dorman, devour the land along the banks there, and while a very rare trailer or barn might be spotted, signs of civilization become scant, save for towering cross-river power lines or a Titan blinking radio tower. The shores grow quiet, and the traffic out on the water grows quiet with them. Sure, on a weekend you might bump into a couple fishermen out that way over the course of an afternoon or evening. One Sunday, I was nearly tipped over by the wake of a racing boat full of firefighters from Lexington, in a specially marked craft, probably on an exercise of some kind. But even with the occasional exception, the place feels remote despite the press of roads within a mile or two of either shore of the river, and especially on a weekday, it's rare to hear engine or voice upriver. It was around this time last year when I took my final trip up the Kentucky. Red River Gorge and the spans of both river and trail closer to home become absolutely unlivable in October for the sheer density of visitors blocking paths with tents, stopping in the middle of rough-hewn tunnel or switchback highway turn to take pictures from car windows, or shouting off ridge lines and bolting every animal down valley with the echo in the process. And so, despite the loveliness of the leaves and the pleasant autumn scents of the woods in this season, it is often my habit to stick to the cliffs and caves and creeks of my own land, or that of neighbors, and save my wanderings beyond for winter, when the cold and damp keeps most of the worst at bay. But multiple times over last year's summer, I'd been taken by a group of friends upriver from that High Bridge boat launch along the Kentucky. While it was near 2 hours driving from my home to get there, most of my friends were much closer, making it a convenient place to put in on kayaks for the busier among us. Saddled with the demands of predictable work and unpredictable family delays, the others had more interruptions to worry over day to day, and I didn't mind starting a bit earlier every few weeks for meetups there. Frankly, even with the needs of my friends aside, the landscape along that stretch of the Kentucky is well worth the drive. Great shading cliffs soar up to shield the river-goer from sun, and the wind whistles through holes and crevices in the stone 100 feet up. Trees never thinned for home or business grow ancient and thick along slopes crowded up against the feet of those cliffs, and often hang wide out over the eaves of the waterway, letting one weave through reaching root and toppled trunk free of the worst of the heat. Deer, the odd stray cow, and once in a great while near dusk, a rare fox, can be seen drinking in the shallows if one is quiet. Heron and turtles sun or scan on dead or living branch in the water, and pike are so thick in certain seasons that they thump the bottom of your boat like drummers, as the fervent fish hunt flies along the surface. On one of my first trips out one July years back, a foot-long grass pickerel, one among many breaching the water, actually threw itself up into the kayak of a friend as he passed. All this to say, the water is quiet, the land is verdant and good, and the woodland, despite standing on the banks of a generally well-trafficked river, is as untouched as one could hope for on this span of the continent. We had paddled up perhaps 15 miles out from the launch at High Bridge midway through September, and as October crept up, there were a few plans for an autumn trip, but all fell through. After several failed attempts to organize, I figured I would go out on my own. While I put in on my own several times a week in Beattyville, this was to be my first trip alone onto a stretch of the river that far west. Aside from the cooler weather and the changing leaves, there were, as I saw it, 3 main draws for a solo trip. Firstly, there was an old, haggard-looking 20-pound anchor we'd stumbled on during our September trip half buried in a gravel bank along the shore, and for one reason or another, I'd become obsessed with replacing my dinky little 5-pound fishing anchor with it. I kept cursing myself for not digging the rusty thing up and hauling it with us, and far as it was upriver, it would make a good end goal for a long day on the river. The second was a small but well-formed runoff cave we'd found last trip up one of the feeder creeks, which I'd been planning to rig up a paracord rope guide for before our next group outing. The third and most important was a lack of schedule, for if my only companion was to be my dog, then I could go on a weekday and linger out on the water as long as I wanted. I'd gotten a cheap lighting setup for the kayak the month prior, and while I'd taken it out around dusk once or twice near home, I hadn't done any real night boating with it. I could drive the 2 hours out to High Bridge in the afternoon without having to rise early, take my time working upriver to get the anchor, light a nice campfire and get a little drunk on the muddy beach as the sun set, and then paddle home in the dark, getting my fill of frog and bug song before the winter put an end to it. And so, waking later around 10 on a Wednesday, I loaded up the truck with everything I'd need. Wet bag for the phone, lighter, tobacco, and any toilet paper I'd carry. Life jacket for the dog and some rations for the both of us. Bacon and sausages for the campfire I'd planned. A ratty old cooler for water and a dozen ciders. Some waterproof tape and seal to patch any leaks if I grounded the boat too hard or hit up on trash in the shallows. Then, finally, the haggard but reliable sit-inside I'd used faithfully for 4 years. The kayak itself was a sickly, sun-bleached blue, made white and ragged along the belly by scuff from rock or concrete drags, and an equally sickly yellow inside. But with a hull which refused to die, and a carrying capacity just shy of 400 pounds, it could handle anything I'd need to fit in it. I got the dog hooked up in the back seat and piled in for the drive. The trip up the mountain parkway and across Lexington was uneventful. Not too many cars on the road in the middle of the day, and no need for stops. When I rolled through the little college town of Wilmore and out into the rolling hill country along the Kentucky River, I found mine was the only vehicle winding that way along the shady route down to the water. The area is called the Palisades, for the cliffs along the banks can be 200 or 300 feet high, and the gorge formed by the river is shady and deep, especially by the standards of the surrounding country, which is far removed from the Appalachian core. As a consequence, the drive down Lock 7 Road to the shore was dark, with rugged rock face hugging parts of the right-hand stretch. The older homes there cling to the land beneath walls of stone, and the oaks grow tall and heavy-limbed over the steep, narrow road. It was then, as had so often been the case, a soothing and lonely path to a soothing stretch of shady water. I turned into the small gravel lot a little before 1 in the afternoon. There was just one single car waiting there, a beaten-up little Subaru with an empty rack on top. It was a sparse crowd even for a weekday, made all the sparser by the fact the guy from the Subaru was wheeling his little fishing peddler up the ramp, as I was hauling my kayak down it. Cooler in place, lights fixed up front and in back, dry bag tethered down in the rear. I had everything I needed in place within just a few minutes. My excitement only grew as I heard the rumble of the other car's departing engine and drank in the sight before me on the bank. The soft, broad, green waterway spanning the gorge bottom was as clear as I'd ever seen it after a rare couple weeks without autumnal rain, the growing cold of winter's slow approach helping to bring the shallows into focus as algae and bugs died off. Just one more trip back up to the truck to unload my companion was all it would take, and I'd be alone out on that perfect water. Boy, my whippet, was patiently waiting, as always. Strapped into his life vest, he trotted down to the water's edge with me, stopping to scent the wind along the way. I almost imagined he felt the rarity of the occasion as keenly as I did, for he lingered long on the worn concrete overlooking the water before finally leaping into the kayak, a rarity for him. I can't help but wonder now, in hindsight, if something in the air hinted to his keener senses that something was off, some tinge on the slow wind about us, or taint in that seemingly clear and calm current. Whatever the case, he eventually joined me in the boat without complaint. I hooked the leash on his vest up to mine, a precaution against any leaps after low-swooping birds, and we wound off upriver away from the low mechanical hums of Loch 7. The few riverside houses that dot the shore of the Kentucky around the bend to the big bridge are in varying states of decay, with a couple seeming new and refurbished, but most leaning towards rot. Docks swept half away by flood rises are left to sink year by year deeper into the mud of the river bottom. Decking sags with age from the backs of stilt-raised homes, their paint faded under even the muted light which reaches the bottom of the gorge beneath the cliffs and towering trees flanking the river. While some were likely residential homes, most others were almost always quiet and still. Boats tethered and aging along those few docks still sturdy enough to hold them. Whether they were rental properties meant for Airbnb listings, as was the scourge back in my neck of the woods, or just seldom-used vacation homes, their stillness meant I saw no trace of humanity, save the buildings and boats themselves, until I laid eyes on High Bridge. The rail crossing is hundreds of feet up, held aloft on old reddened metal still strong despite its age. The track disappears on either side into gullies in the stone atop the cliffs, and when a train is coming, you can hear the faint rumble of it in the steel as you bob and float beneath the bridge. So it was this time, Boy snorting once his displeasure at the bassy sound as I paddled hard under the bridge, got us out onto the other side, and then turned sidelong against the slow flow of the river to watch the heavy freight hauler trundle across on its way east. The noise of the horn and the heft of its passage echoed long down the canyon either way, and suddenly shook the water where we floated underneath. Then, as the thunder passed, it was on by the still and placid mouth of the Dix River, and further into the silent corridor of the Kentucky past the bridge. There, the last few docks were left behind, and the river wound into the obscuring shadow of Lonely Ridge and flaming fall forest. The rocks here feel like something out of a surreal and half-recalled dream, segmented and layered as they meet the water, and rough-hewn by wind and rain on the heights atop the gorge. In places, the clean and angular breaks of them at the waterline give the impression that brick or slab have been quarried from the sheets in tiers, and with the leaves only just beginning to fall in earnest, the shade thrown over them in the shallows gives roots and the limbs of long-drowned trees an eerie cast, as if vast skeletal fingers reach up from the haze of the water to claw at the stone and mud. Every bend in the river unveils another span which looks as if it were pulled from a time long gone, and only glimpsed in the now by some accident of temporal happenstance. The riverbank itself is treacherous. It is either comprised of steep sheeted rock, or between these outcrops, sloped mud too steep and deep to be easily beached and disembarked on. Only the runoff creeks which feed the river, spilling down in falls large and small from the rocky heights overhead through dark wooded gullies, manage to make lasting beaches. Every third or half of a mile, where one of these low-worn stream beds meets with the banks, deposits of stone and silt and muddy sand carried down slope from the forest in storm or surge jut out into the languid current. On rougher days when rain has been fierce and the current makes paddling hard, it can be tiring to leap upstream from one of these beaching spots to the next against the press of the oncoming water. But that unseasonably dry October, the long lack of rainfall meant the current was nearly still, and I made it the better part of 2 miles up from the bridge in excellent time. My goal was the mouth of one of the largest feeder streams on that span of the Kentucky, at whose roots could be found the cave I planned to rope up to. The outcrop of silty beach there was large. I landed the kayak in the shallows, plopped the dog on land to wander, and dragged the boat up out of the water. I wrenched out a flashlight from the dry bag, slipped out the phone to check the time, and downed some water. The shape of the beach and the pleasant hum of life along the wooded bank was so pleasant and so ordinary to me, familiar with the area as I was, that it took me some time to straighten up and look properly along the creek, where Boy was now lingering, expecting the climb to come. But he seemed tense, wary, and as I looked past him into what should have been a dark, overhung span of creek bed beyond, I thought I understood why. Where once low-hanging bough and branch had hung to shade the runoff stream, a great slick of flattened trees bowed outward onto the bank. The weed-thick mud walls to either side of the dried-up stream had been shorn entirely away, tripling the width of the path. What stone or long-dead wood jutted up from the creek bottom was tan with dried mud. It looked for all the world as if some mighty surge of water had poured down from the heights back in the woods and out to the river, leaving the exit rent and torn by a current which had since departed. This was not exactly a strange sight along the Kentucky River. As with so many other bodies of water down deep in hill country gorges, any large storm was liable to topple trees and reshape the muddy valleys now and again, as rainfall funneled into low channels and raced for the river below. Spots exactly like it could be sighted up and down the Palisades. But to see so sudden a change after so dry and rainless a season was strange. The leaves on the toppled young trees nearest the dry creek bed were still yellow-green with life, and together with the smell of the mud, not stagnant as it so often became in the dark beneath the forest, it gave me the impression the mudslide or water surge had happened within the past day or two. I trudged over the muddy beach to the mouth of the stream, gazing up the way, and eventually pushed along the route with a tentative Boy huffing stifled at my heels. I climbed barefoot, as I usually do. The grip in mud was always better that way, but I found the silty bottom of the creek was dry, despite the damage to the woodland around it, almost baked solid. Usually, my legs would sink into the soup up to my thighs, but this time only light depressions were made, and Boy, light enough to skitter free over the surface, didn't need to be carried over the mess as if it were quicksand. The waterless creek wound a few dozen yards into the woods, and rounding its first bend, my surprise only grew more pronounced. Now, this feeder creek has always been a hidden gem. It expands in the woods to a slick, stone-bottomed series of wide, tiered falls and drops, which climb in steps weaving this way and that to a larger fall up close to the peaks of the ridges hemming in the river gorge. We've never seen any can or container tossed among the leaves and roots of the woods siding the stream, and so far as I know, the quicksand-like soup at the mouth of the usually empty waterway keeps most away from that beautiful corner of the canyon. But today, the dark, moss-gnawed rock of the tiered falls was smeared and dirtied with pale mud and grime, as if a great bank of mud had been rubbed on a vast paint roller down the middle of the way. It was caked and cracking on jutting stone, and in the low places where the sheets of solid rock gave way to soft, rounded gravel, the pebbles were furrowed and rustled. It was, in all my trips up that runoff lane, the first time I'd ever seen anything like it. I began to climb the stair-like rise stone to stone, my body low to the ground, and my weight always forward in case of a slip. The dog, agile as he was, generally enjoyed this part of an outing most of all, the chance to skitter up the stone like an acrobat, and scuttle happily along the banks in search of smells. But though Boy climbed, he did not do so playfully, and he lingered long behind me as I went, smelling the banks and eyeing cautiously the dried earthen smear down the middle of the bed. Though I smelled nothing myself, I was reminded of his behavior tracing the paths of wandering skunks through the yard back home, the obsessive, wary patrol of a place made unfamiliar by the passage of an intruder. But this, I assured myself, was a silly thought to have. We were in the middle of a thickly forested, quiet stretch of riverbank, after all. Any animal could be meandering and marking the creek bed we walked, and any of those beasts could raise the same response in Boy. And so I pressed on up rise after rise, ascending 100 and more feet before coming to the largest drop in the chain of falls, the dog pacing at a distance behind, head low to the ground. The uppermost fall formed a great bowl in the layered stone, mossy and slick even after long weeks without fresh fall of water. A still, clear pool of water sat serene in the low, worn basin beneath the rock face, and several tiny minnows and a particularly large crayfish darted to the shadows as I passed it by. It was obvious to me immediately, though, that all was not as it should be. Coming to the north edge of the bowl, and looking up into the trees sloping upward to the heights of the ridge, I saw that, just as had been the case at the mouth of the creek, a great swathe of flattened elm and oak and beech jutted out over the lip of the bowl. A streak in the loose hillside loam and soil led down from the base of the cliff above right to the drop, where the streaked mud and scattered debris began its path down to the river far off at my back. And at its peak, only vaguely familiar to my eyes, was the shadowy, angular mouth of a runoff cave, the very one I'd been looking for. The forest about it was so tarnished and thinned that it took me a moment, despite my prior visits to this little fissure in the earth, to recognize it as being what it was. But once I had registered that the source of all this disturbance was there at the cave mouth, the changes along the creek suddenly made much more sense to me, and rationalizing them away became easier. My friends and I had long debated whether the cave was fed by some subterranean springs, or whether sinkholes and porous dirt on the top of the gorge fed it with rainwater, which then trickled slow out the mouth to join the larger runoff creek at the base of the falls. The fact that such an enormous current of water seemed to have swept down from the cave itself during a period of dry, windy weather seemed to indicate that the mild, gurgling brook which swelled up from its moss-eaten mouth must be fed from below. What exactly would cause such a massive burst of floodwater from so mild a cave system, I could not say, but it put me at pronounced ease to be given a simple explanation for the sudden changes to the landscape around me. Wasting no time, I rolled up onto one of the lips of layered stone comprising the wall, lifted the stretching dog up behind me, and then boosted him up onto the steep, marred forest floor, which swept up to the cave, only to hoist myself up on cautious legs behind him. From there, I drew out a length of paracord from the bag and secured it tight around a living trunk low on the slope. Leaving a segment of line hanging down into the bowl at the base of the fall, I worked my way up towards the cave from tree to tree, running and securing the line, weaving along the edge of the newly flattened mud swathe down the center of the hill. The terrain was uneven, but it was dry, and my slips and recoveries were few and far between. Progress was quick, and before long, I was up at the base of the little rock outcrop that housed the cave itself, tying off the last length to a sturdy old stump at the base. It was then, looking back along the line I'd just ran, that I realized Boy had not followed. He was lingering halfway down the hill, not sniffing or inspecting the damage on the incline, but rather looking expectantly up at me from below. I called, waving him onward, and though he did come, he slunk low to the earth and glanced often into the shadowy dips and gnarls in the trees about us, as if expecting any moment for something to slip free of them and give chase. Now, it's worth saying that, during prior visits to this very cave, Boy had climbed up eagerly with the rest of us. The cave itself is walkable for a few dozen yards at a slight hunch, with the creek tunnel being just broad enough to walk single file through the stream. It ends, so far as we've gone, at a tight squeeze between two horizontal slabs of stone, through which the trickle of water issues. Boy, never particularly squeamish about the dark or the wet, was always happy to walk in with us and snap at crickets on the walls scattering in the beams of our lights. But as I shimmied up onto the ledge where the mossy spill came pouring out of the cliff and looked off into the shadows inside, Boy sat stubbornly below me on the forest floor, refusing to climb. He also, crucially, barked twice, halting, shrill, alarmed. Given he was an unusually quiet dog not given to any vocalization, this worried me more than any of the other behavior I'd seen of him this past half hour beneath the trees. I had planned on going back into the passage to the end, short and mild as it was, to see if something inside had changed, an inner shift to match the outer devastation. But with Boy trembling below and wary about proceeding, I settled for a quick check, striding fast through cold, clear water with my head hunched and coming to the first bend in the tunnel, still in full glare of the afternoon sun outside. And craning around, I could see far off through the jagged jut of this or that wall in my beam that the rear of the runoff cavern was still just as it had been when last I'd been there with friends, a tight pinch between two slabs less than a foot wide, which trickled a slow murmur of water into the stream at my feet. The stream bed itself was, perhaps, a bit smoother, free of many of the stones and drifts of silt which once had coated it. But otherwise, there was nothing there in that dripping channel to suggest the destruction which had raged outside. Strange, too, was the lack of water, for just as it had always been, the waterway chilling my bare feet was only a trickle, and the echoing path within was quieter than ever I'd heard it. Boy was barking when I emerged, and only calmed down when I'd slid off the ledge and worked back down the hill with him into the bowl. Our job was done, and any real examination of the cave could wait, I told myself, for a future visit with a larger group, where we'd now have an easy paracord line up. I waved Boy on, and he rushed down the stair of the falls towards the river, waiting at each turn in the route or dip in the terrain for me to catch up, looking back at me, as if urging me forward. Eventually this hushed hurry on his part rubbed off on me, and though I heard or saw nothing aside from that big muddy streak along the way, I felt suddenly as if I were trespassing, and escape was necessary if I was to avoid being found. I was happy, at length, to emerge back into the sun upon the bank and slip the kayak back onto the river soon after. But my thoughts lingered on the end of that mud streak impressed in that misshapen beach of stone and sand, and as we pushed off and I began the further paddle upriver, I recall gazing back over my shoulder at where it sank into the water. I'd never in all my years seen any runoff stream on this river, even during bad flooding, leave marks like that. It was not unlike the depressions left by crocodiles sunning on the banks of the Nile, as if a heavy belly had been there to cave in and smooth out the silt as it wriggled itself back into the cooling current of the Kentucky. And though I told myself this was silly, and it was easy to dismiss it as such under the striking light of a beautiful, if overcast, day out on open water, I could not wholly put it out of my mind. This nagging memory colored much of the rest of the trip upriver. For hours, mile after mile, I wound on through the towering avenues of the gorge, still alone and still surrounded by terrain and woodland which seemed pulled from an earlier age. But on that particular afternoon, this still and quiet expanse, rather than allowing me to feel at ease, made me feel alone. For though now and then a power line passed far overhead as the towers jumped the river, or a plane hummed above the clouds as a reminder of the world beyond this chasm in the hills, there were few animals to be seen or heard. Bugs seemed less thick in the air, and fish didn't break the water to hunt or dance in their roving schools. Birds were nowhere to be seen on the roots upon the banks, and deer did not break the brush to flee at the passage of my boat. The wind was, I remember, the only constant companion to the dog and I as the paddle broke the water, and carried us around bend after bend, the day growing longer and the shadows deeper all the while. Still I pushed, the motion keeping me warm as the sun sank lower, and the temperature in the low gorge above the cooling water dipped down with the sinking of the sun. At last, rounding another bend in the river, I saw in the distance the unique jut of another silty beach deposited by a runoff creek, which swept out into the current like a hook. The still pool against the shore which was formed by this hook we called the swimming hole, and it was common to use it as an end point to long days on the river. There we would soak and cool down after enduring the heat of summer days, drink, and recover our breath for the paddle back down river. This is where we'd found that half-buried old anchor on a prior trip, and marked the end of my road for the day. But I was stopped before I reached that beach. There was a white shape caked in mud and jutting out from a gnarl of roots at the cliff bottom off to my right as I passed, and as I approached, I realized it was not just some drift of plastic or foam on the river. It was a simple boat, a small, 10 or so foot metal-bodied, motored thing. It was flipped upside down, and the nose of it was wedged up under the tree in the shallows. The bottom was streaked and bent, but not breached, as if it had scraped up along the stone and mud of the riverbank before coming to rest where it lay. Some of the bark of the roots against which it had come to bob was shorn away, and fresh, recent sap and color spoke to a fairly violent impact. But the hull of the boat was not that malformed, and it was difficult for me to imagine the boat itself was responsible for the scars on the waterside trees. There was no sign of anyone having left the craft, no prints in the mud at the cliff base, or scent of bodies lurking unseen in the hollow under the flipped vessel. But Boy, nestled as he was between my legs in the kayak, was not calm. He was scenting the air and whining low, and trembling with a nervous fear I knew had little to do with the dropping temperature. And as I closed in on the wreck, he bayed, a strange, lilting, screeching noise I'd never heard him make. I turned reflexively at that noise, and made instead for the beach and the anchor. The hook-shaped silt band was one of the less rocky of these little runoff creek beaches, allowing me to safely run the kayak aground and drag it up onto the shore without fuss. Boy was quick to hop out and watched as I wove through the reedy brown grass and tangled dead brush to the space near the creek mouth where the anchor lay. I pulled it free, washed it off in the shallows, and then laid it out in the base of the kayak, the objective of the day's mission complete. The sky was growing colorful beyond the clouds, and I pulled out my phone to see it was just past 6. I sent messages in the group chat with shots of the rope I'd set up, updated a relative that I was at the halfway point, and then settled in to make a fire on the beach. The dry, sun-bleached wood scattered among the stones there made for good fuel, and soon a small blaze was crackling away, and I had downed 2 of the cold ciders from my cooler. I sat in the dry mud and gravel with the dog straddling my lap, watching the dance of fire and looking out over the river as the approach of dusk lent warm color to the cold water. But my eyes found again that stark white outline in the roots up the way, and I found I could not so easily ignore it. I had time as the fire burned down to coals and I waited to cook our dinner to check. I felt, sitting there and gazing out at that bleached boat bottom in the gloom, that I couldn't justly sit there and rest without first checking that the wreck was truly empty. So I left a nervous boy huddled by the lowering fire, and trudged carefully along the steep mud shallows the 100 or so yards back down the river. Perched on the shore above the root tangle, I wedged the paddle of my kayak, which I'd carried as a cane on the slick shore, beneath the lip of the boat. Turning it over with some effort after nudging it free of the worst of the tangle, I found it was indeed empty. No awful remnants or drowned raids bobbed up out of the muddy tangle beneath to greet me, and a great weight seemed to lift from my shoulders as I stepped back from the edge and paced the shore back to the fire, where Boy awaited me. I tucked into the cooler for a 3rd and 4th cider, and drank them as I cooked over the coals, breaking segments off for the dog as he sat and watched. Then a 5th as I lit a bowl and my pipe, and tasted the cheap Captain Black I'd brought, and wistfully watched distant flights of birds trace the skies southward overhead. For a while, we were placid, and the silent wind, tantalizing smoke, and deepening reds of dusk conspired with the alcohol to make me mellow and pleasantly lethargic. But as time wore on, maybe 7:15, judging by the gathering darkness as I remember it, Boy tensed up, and refused a strip of bacon I pushed his way. I followed his eyes out over the calm water, and listened as he growled low. And then movement. A shift on the opposing bank amidst a shroud of obscuring boughs thrown low over the edge. Across the river, where a sharp hill at the foot of the cliffs met the water, the branches of the low trees were swaying where their fingers touched the surface. Distinct ripples were emanating out across the still riverway, and the subtle sound of water being disturbed by something large was followed by the echoing slap of small breakers up and down the chasm as the waves struck home upon this or that shore. In the shadow behind those branches, I could not be certain, but it looked to me in dusk's light, squinting over distance and through the haze of a buzz, as if a great stretch of the opposing muddy bank had given way and slid smooth down into the river below. Boy was barking again, shrill, nervous. I went to the kayak, and fumbling in my dry bag, pulled out the large flashlight I'd brought for the cave and the trip back. But scanning the deepest shadows of the shallows across the water, I saw no motion beyond the bob and sway of disturbed branches, and discerned no source for the ripples still crashing downriver. Still, I scanned back and forth up the water as the dog continued his protest, suddenly gripped with a fear I could not wholly explain. But I spotted nothing, and as the last of the daylight died, I returned to my fire and added wood to it. There was an old memory rattling around in my mind, one whose echoes had rung when I'd been up near the cave, and which now solidified in my thoughts as I gazed down into the smoke. I recalled a story I'd been told by my grandfather decades ago, up in Danville. He had been old enough to have been told by his father of a time when there was no dam on the Dix River, and Harrington Lake, the reservoir created by bottling up the flow and filling the gorge, did not exist. Harrington is hundreds of feet deep, and fills a gorge not unlike the Palisades through which I'd paddled. And he was fond of saying that, in boyhood, my great-grandfather had fondly remembered plumbing the caves which had lined the walls of that great gorge, now sunk beneath the water raised by the dam. There was, my grandfather was prone to tell us, a monster in Lake Harrington. We were not often out on the lake, but after the fashion of spooking the smaller children with harmless tales, he enjoyed lacing those few occasions we did go out onto the water with stories of boyhood sightings, of black shapes in the water glimpsed at dusk, or of thumping impacts on boat bottoms when the steep cliffs of the lakeshore allowed for no tree or stone to jut out and scrape a hull. He used to speculate that it went down into the old drowned caves below the lake when the winters grew hard, and skulked up into light when the summer came and warmed the pool. And I told myself now, just as I had then, that this was pure campfire tale fabrication, a legend to imbue the world with mystery for me at a young and adventurous age. And yet, story or no, it lingered. My plan had been to start back immediately, but there was a cold fear gripping my chest now, and though I could not have said why, I kept glancing to the overturned boat down the way and summoning up the image of the great slick below the cave stream far behind me. My impulses, much like my dog, were telling me something was amiss. I would never have admitted it to myself, but the reason I sat and waited to strap up the lights and start the paddle back downriver was not because I simply wished to sit and drink and enjoy the night for a little bit longer. Indeed, I didn't touch the rest of my ciders, and smoked more in a vain attempt to sharpen my senses than in any desire to unwind. I looked out into the blackness, cursing now the clouds which had made the afternoon so cool, and which now drowned out any moon or starlight which might aid my straining eyes. But I saw and heard nothing. Boy settled down and quieted on my lap, though still he kept his head up and scanned the world about us just as I did. Perhaps an hour passed like that, tending the flames as they chewed down to ember again, and drinking water rather than cider when thirst taunted me. And no water shifted on the river, the calm which had settled in again stretching on unbroken. The dog, still alert, did not whine or bark into the young night. Yet there seemed something off to me, some lull in the bug or frog sounds, or stillness in the brush along the river. And yet I told myself I was more accustomed to the sounds of summer, and that this unease in me was more down to being here during cooler times, a thing of season, rather than any stranger circumstance. Did the sounds of the river not ebb back home when the nights grew cold? There were, I assured myself, 100 reasons Boy might have been on edge, deer foremost among them. And there were an equal list of perfectly explicable things which could lead to a bit of mudbank slipping free along an unstable shore, or the abandonment of a cheap overturned boat by its owner. And so as the temperature dipped, and the air grew wet with a light fog thrown up by the river, and I ran low on dry wood available to burn on my little beach, I slowly lost some of the irrational nervousness which had chilled me near dusk. Thinking of the long drive back to my house in the hills, and the comfort of my bed which awaited me there, I fixed the big flashlight to the nose of my kayak, got the dim flashers on front and back, and then piled my gear into the belly of the thing atop the muddy anchor I'd come all this way to fetch. But the dog seemed hesitant to join me. I had to carry him over to the boat, and even then, though he did not fight, he seemed to be leaning for the shore as I pushed us gently out into the shallows and took my seat to row us back. I covered him up with a jacket to keep the worst of any cold drips from the paddle off him, and though it was night and the low visibility meant the chances of boys spotting and jumping off the kayak towards something were all but none, I still hooked his vest to mine with his leash. I would not have gone out onto the water if I had not thoroughly thought myself into confidence that there was nothing out of place in the river. And yet I recall that I paddled softly, as if wishing to limit my disturbance of that cool, still water. I made fast for the far bank, which I knew to be slightly more navigable in the dark due to the wider gaps between root or fallen tree limb, and then stuck to the shallows. This in itself was odd, for the best place to be in the dark to avoid unwanted collisions with long-drowned tree trunks is the deepest core of the waterway. But again, in all that bleak silence, I seemed to have silently decided that the bumps and scrapes of the shoreline were well worth the trouble. My visibility was limited, as in any night paddle of mine, to the narrow cone of bright light thrown out by the powerful beam on the nose up front. I could trace the shore as it shifted from cliff foot to mud bank and back again, of course, but I could also see the shadows of gnarled tree limbs hazy through the water, and weave to avoid thumping the bottom with them. Still, some snuck through, or my adjustments did not take me far enough to wholly avoid them, making the rumble of long-dead wood against plastic a common staple of the trip downriver. Even though I knew these to be harmless, after all, I'd sustained more than a few bumps on every trip I'd ever bothered to take up this river. The dark and my deep-buried uncertainty colored every such sound or shift below the boat with a menace it did not warrant. Boy, too, was on edge, and though now he shuddered in silence, he did not settle down to nap, as was his wont during night paddles. Instead, he stood with his bony paws digging into the flesh of my thigh, looking out into the belly of the river over the side, eyes wide and nostrils flared. It was nearly 3 tense hours, counting the landmarks and beaches in the dark as we went, before I saw it. We had just pushed under a large span of power lines crossing the gorge, and past the mouth of the damaged cave stream across the way. The boat ramp was, if a good pace could be maintained, less than an hour away, and around the next bend ahead, the lights of docks and the looming shape of the high bridge itself would be visible to us. It was beginning to feel as if all was well, and though the water and woods about us were still stony and strangled, I was already dwelling on what I'd eat when I finally arrived home before sleep. The most primordial feeling, isolated span of the river was at our backs, and regardless of what rational soothing I'd fed myself, I was already silently celebrating a smooth return. The cliff at my side, marking the harsh stony span of riverside, was giving way to mud and soil and forest again, and an old tree long fallen from the hill lay at a shallow angle out into the water, bone-white and barkless, its barren head sunken beneath the hazy surface. I turned towards the center of the river to swing out around the obstacle, and in doing so, threw the light on the nose of my kayak out for deeper water. And something huge moved out there, just a dozen or so yards out towards the middle, just a few boats' lengths away. Something slow and ponderous, but graceful in the water. I could not see the full sweep of it. The pinch of the beam showed me the thing bit by bit as it passed, with the forward sections slipping back into the murk just as others left it. It was not far below the surface, and like a great fish, its flesh or scales or substance seemed to dance with subtle reflections in the cold light. It moved not unlike an eel, but the silhouette of the thing was jagged along the sides in the vague, green-tinted water, as if frills of fins or limbs hung limp and flowing upon either flank of the body. Then, never once breaching the surface, the last of it passed just as quickly as it had appeared, leaving no ripples or wake, and raising no sound to betray its presence. Had I not thrown the beam out in its direction at that moment, I would never have known it was there. Boy growled low as I fumbled with the paddle in suddenly jittery hands, turning back for the fallen tree. Rather than going around, I pushed under the low trunk in a squeeze, nose nearly touching the forward body of the kayak, Boy pinched in my lap, and the barkless trunk scraping smooth along my back. I poled along the muddy bottom, just a foot or two deep beneath me, until we were nestled in a dense tangle of dead branches off to the side of the tree, thrust up like a clawed cage from the bank. With the hull wedged between these and the steep mud, I leaned up over the shivering dog and yanked a backup light out of the dry bag. It was a headlight, bright but not far-reaching. Desperately scanning the water off to our side, I saw nothing. Just the serpentine shapes of limb and root jutting up like mangled fangs in the shallows, and the open expanse of mist-wreathed open river beyond. Then forward, into the tangle of dead wood and stone up ahead. Again, nothing. No hint of motion, or glint of reflection in the shadow. For a long while we sat like that, me wheeling this way and that with the light, and seeing nothing to warrant the pounding in my chest. And I attempted, in vain, to convince myself it had been a trick of the light, that I had not seen what I thought I saw. That night on this river made every floating log look like a crocodilian skull, and made every glance upon the bottom of a kayak sound like skeletal fingers scratching at the hull. But try as I might, my breath did not come easier, and I could not bring my hands to push us back out into more navigable water. I sat there with the shaking dog, watched for signs which did not come, and waited. I knew, even if there was no rational reason to believe so, that there was something out there, that the thing from the cave, thoughts of which I had kept buried all these hours on the water, was waiting out beyond the tangle. And then, as I bobbed petrified there, the dog twitched and wheezed, startled, and looking down, I first thought there was a wet tree limb or branch draped over the edge of the boat. In the headlight's glaring beam, though, details became more refined, and in that single second of observation, I registered it was a fleshy thing, coated in mucus or slime, limber with lack of bone. A greenish-brown almost perfectly suited to the river's deeps, and, strangest of all, fingered. It looked almost botanical, like some thick vine, a bit smaller than my forearm, slithered silent up out of the water into the basin of the kayak, where it now cautiously reached for the tether which bound my jacket to the dog's. And like a snake in strike, it moved fast when the time came, clasping tight and making to yank the soft meat in the boat out through the protective tangle and down into the deeper water, where I imagined a vast shape skulked in the shadow. I reacted on instinct, not practiced skill or smooth decision. I unclasped my jacket from the line, and as the hushed rush of flesh over plastic sounded, and the vine-like limb which had snaked so stealthily up to us slid to snap taut like a fishing line, I got Boy free from his side, just in time. The leash snapped with shocking force up over the edge and down into the water, where yet more of the many-fingered tendrils were rising up out of the clouded mud raised by the struggle, flawlessly blending with the straggling dead branches about them. I tipped over towards the bank out of the boat, dragging Boy with me, and we kicked and slid back into the woods up the steep slope. Below us, a great central tentacle or limb had clasped the kayak we'd left behind, and with the help of its smaller twins, the thing warped and bent the plastic hull in two against the waterlogged trees about it. The mangled shape of the boat gurgled as it was dragged out beyond the reach of the headlight into deeper water. The soft reds and greens of the blinkers in back and front, along with the cold beam of the flashlight on the nose, lingered for several seconds in the cloudy liquid before being snuffed out. And then I was running and stumbling up the bank to the cliff bottom, Boy under my arm like a football, mangling the skin of my face and hands on branches as I went. I eventually slowed enough to slip on the headlight, but then was right back to flight, tracing the gorge's edge and winding out towards the bridge step by shaky step in the bramble and briar. A half-hour's breathless tumble brought me to a cleared yard in the woods, the black shape of an empty old rental, and I sprinted wet and shaking down the path onto Dick's Drive. From there, I ran the entire distance to the boat ramp along the aging asphalt, thinking all the while of those vast slicks through the trees below the cave. I had no idea how agile whatever it was would be on land, and I kept imagining that each crash of a bolting deer or echo of my own frantic footfalls was the sound of pursuit coming up from the banks far off through the trees on my left. The houses along the riverfront were silent, their occupants asleep or away. Though I reached the truck, my keys had been in my dry bag, and I couldn't get in. I ended up rigging a leash for Boy from a bungee cord in the bed of the truck and hiking the hour and a half out of the gorge and into Wilmore, where I called family to pick me up, still barefoot and breathless from the river. The next afternoon, I came back out to get the truck and hiked down to the water's edge where I'd left the boat. But there was no trace of it, though, with time, I've come to imagine its wreckage was likely eventually wedged up by current or creature in the tangles along the banks. I've never found any trace of reporting on missing people, or searches out on the river, or, for that matter, sightings of anything strange there. But I did, as time passed and thought settled, think more and more back on that tall tale about a beast below Harrington Lake I'd been woven in my youth. Now, a tall tale woven for me as a boy seems less harmless and less rootless, and my grandfather is no longer here to elaborate for me. I am left with the image of a rubbery, boneless thing pressing its body, the width of a young whale, through crannies the size of a human skull, of a fleshy body spilling out of some crevice in the earth and tumbling down to find itself in new waters downstream, where the Dix River meets the Kentucky, just a scant few miles from that dam at Lake Harrington. Real or imagined, it does not matter. The notion alone is bad enough. I could never truly bring myself to tell my friends what had happened. They've been out on the river several times this year without me, and nothing untoward has happened to them. That stretch of the Kentucky is trapped between a series of locks, and while it does feel remote despite the press of roads around it, it's wholly possible whatever was in there abandoned it, slinking back into its tunnels. Assuming, of course, I didn't imagine the thing entirely, and Boy's newfound fear of water is born of a shared illusion between us. I do not go out on the Kentucky River, or any other river, anymore. Even up in Lee County right by the house, where many locks separate the forked roots of the current from the main body downriver in High Bridge, I don't gamble with the open water, even under the full light of day. Even if its deepest point is little more than 40 feet down and its flow is strangled by the lock system, its water remains murky with the mud and algae of the season, and anything might well be lurking beneath it. Thank you to patrons Aidan Pascoe, Alteron, Andrew Jackman, BJ Drapp, Bongo, Boris Vulich, CJ2845, Colby Redding, Cool Story Bruh, Dumb Stuff Personified, Icefire, L. Monroe, Evan Graham, Philip Blomquist, Philip Nordland, Jason Maki, Jennifer Tran, JHB, Jonas Pinna, Ken Frausto, Laura, Luca Zanzi, Magpie Fly, Noah Kaplan, Rob, Ryan Fahey, Sonia Van Buskirk, Souptastic, Strawman 1103, Ted Tarr, Wait, did you just hear that noise behind us? Weapons and Stuff 93, Wes, William Copeland, and William Richardson. Thanks to YouTube members Mad Topher, Gull Dukakis, Krampus Critiques, Don Dawson, Cheshire Vapor, Ryan Scott, Marco Miklos, Dumb Stuff Personified, Colonel Johnson, Vega, Canadine, Hoshea Kozilla, User Uzi, Foxy Paz Toddy, Gerard Santora, Vitor, Michael Clement, Timothy Pickett, Kung Tung, Billy Mater Jr., Trevor Canny, Bilbo's Stankface, Andrew Kane, Craig Sips, IT2, JHB, Americana, and Julius.